Hey folks, this is Docs. Just coming in before the episode begins to say, we have an email address, bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. We also have a Twitter account, @brightbuddhism. We would like to hear from our listeners. Let us know if you have a question about Buddhism. We might answer them on the show. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, I see you are troubled. What weighs on you?
I am troubled. I worry that because I worry, lament, grieve, and have anger, I will not ever be able to reach enlightenment or Buddhahood.
I see. You worry because you worry. Hermit, do you think there is anyone who is locked out of nirvana, who is completely unable to reach Buddhahood?
I'm not sure. Me and rocks and trees, probably.
Trees are the most enlightened of us all, but that is beside the point. Some followers teach that everything and everyone is of a nature that is enlightened and of the Buddha. Every sentient being worries, laments, grieves, and angers. Why should that be a problem for you?
I suppose it's because I am not a tree.
Welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. Today we will be discussing who can and cannot become a Buddha. What do they have to do to become a Buddha? And what is the difference between enlightenment, bodhisattvahood, Buddhahood, and nirvana? I hope you enjoy.
What is the difference between becoming enlightened, becoming a bodhisattva, reaching nirvana, and other similar phrases we've used to describe just the idea of enlightenment?
It's definitely really important to get our vocabulary straight. So, becoming enlightened means to become a Buddha, and that means to become omniscient. Enlightenment is literally to have the entire breadth of wisdom in the universe become illuminated to you. Enlightenment is where you understand the truths of suffering, non-duality, emptiness, karma, impermanence, etc., to the extreme infinite degree. Bodhisattvas, who are these people who we've discussed before a little bit, who attain enlightenment but put off their final nirvana until they've saved all sentient beings, they are enlightened. Bodhisattvas are absolutely enlightened beings. They understand all of this, but they have vowed to put off their enlightenment until they save sentient beings. So they have not renounced their attachments. Bodhisattvas are one step below Buddhas because they still have attachment to all sentient beings. They haven't renounced their final attachment. So even if they are a compassionate and loving being, they're still fundamentally attached. They're still very busy and very involved in the realm of samsara, or the realm of dukkha, which we have talked about as being dissatisfactoriness. On to the term of reaching nirvana. It's quite a hazy topic. The reason why it's hazy and difficult to pin down is samsara, or this realm, this reality, and nirvana presents a dualism, this or that. And Buddhism emphasizes and teaches non-duality to the nth degree. To that end, it's difficult using the texts alone, or even the texts together, to decide what nirvana actually is and how to get there. We can think of it in terms of the word that it is cognate with in Sanskrit, which has to do with to be blown out, or to go out, or cessation. And to that end, a lot of texts believe and propose that it is when you pass on and you don't come back in rebirth. So typically, you become enlightened first, then you become a bodhisattva, so then you save all these sentient beings, and then you become a Buddha because you've saved all these sentient beings. And once you've become a Buddha and you've taught all this stuff, then you pass into extinction, as they call it. Extinction is where you die, and you, in that body, in those 5 aggregates are not reborn. We'll discuss the 5 aggregates at length, and we already have discussed them a little bit in the Mahāsatipatthana Sutta. So nirvana is a hazy topic, but I believe myself that it is exiting the cycle of birth and death, never to return, because you have reached your final enlightenment as a Buddha, and you've renounced all attachments.
So to attempt to keep it straight, bodhisattvas are enlightened but have not achieved nirvana?
Correct.
And at one point I believe you said something along the lines of becoming enlightened means becoming a bodhisattva. I would have to go back and re-listen to the recording. There is a chain of events that you mentioned.
If we had to think about it chronologically,
right,
starting with someone who's never heard about Buddhism, becoming someone who has entered nirvana, according to the teachings, chronologically speaking, or I guess hierarchically speaking, in some cases, this is not my view, but it's the view of some of the schools of Buddhism. Hierarchically speaking, someone leaves their household and seeks to attain enlightenment for themselves. They are the arhat, the renunciant, or the shravaka. All of these terms essentially mean the same thing. Someone who leaves in order to pursue the path. They leave their house, they leave society, they become a monk. So they can attain enlightenment for themselves. They can attain nirvana for themselves. When they become enlightened, they understand the truth of non-self. And they understand the truth of dukkha, or dissatisfactoriness. And they understand the truth of emptiness, impermanence, etc. And then they have the ability, they have the wisdom necessary to save all sentient beings. Then, once they understand those things and they commit to saving all sentient beings, they become a bodhisattva. Bodhisattvas are enlightened, but they have not yet entered nirvana because they are saving everybody first. Once they have saved everybody, once they have achieved enlightenment for all sentient beings, then they are a Buddha. The Buddha has saved everybody because he has turned the Dharma wheel. He's taught us everything. He gave us the sermon on Vulture Peak, and we are all fine. It's sort of like the Jesus story. After he was nailed to the cross, we were all good. And so the Buddha then, once he has taught his teaching, turned the Dharma wheel, and done his entire life, he renounces all attachments. He renounces his final attachments to all sentient beings, to his body, to his idea of self, etc., etc. And once he renounces all of those attachments, he enters his final nirvana. Nirvana being, not only does he have enlightenment, but he dies. And not only does he have enlightenment and also die, but he doesn't come back again. You can have enlightenment, die, and still come back again. Bodhisattvas can be reborn over and over again. Arhats can be reborn over and over again. And Buddhas can be reborn over and over again. But once you renounce all attachments and you've reached your final enlightenment, then you enter nirvana and you don't come back again.
Primary difference between bodhisattva and arhat then would be the bodhisattva is in the process of attempting to save everybody, to help everyone else reach enlightenment as well. Does the arhat necessarily have that step, or is there a path that skips that step straight to nirvana?
There are a couple of different interpretations of that issue. The arhat can reach enlightenment and nirvana for themselves, only for themselves, no one else, and they attain actually what Mahāyāna calls a lesser nirvana. The Theravada school, which we discussed a little bit before, they believe that they cultivate shila, or morality, they cultivate prajna, or wisdom, through meditation and practice, and they can then exit samsara into nirvana and be done. They don't have to save all sentient beings first. Mahāyāna believes in the greater vehicle. That's what Maha translates to. Mahāyāna is the greater or the larger vehicle. There is no way to skip from being a householder or laity or just a common person straight to the Buddhahood step in Mahāyāna. You have to save all sentient beings first. That's what Mahāyāna teaching discusses and deals with and proposes. There are some teachings in Japan and in Korea and China related to the Lotus Sutra, a very, very important transformative sutra that we'll be talking about many times throughout this podcast. They believe that Buddhahood is something that we kind of all have and have had in previous lifetimes, and some of us remember, some of us forget that this is something that's involved, and thus things get messy. Things get really, really messy. So the question of which steps can be skipped, which positions lead into which positions, those all differ based on who you ask. But ultimately, the common theme is that individuals, at the very least, can become enlightened and can achieve nirvana. But they can't do one without the other. They can't do nirvana before enlightenment, and they can't do enlightenment without eventually getting nirvana.
Who can become a Buddha?
This is a very complicated question that changes over time in the Buddhist tradition. Early traditions and later traditions have several different answers to this question. The earlier traditions employ something quite often called Gotra-theory. This is a concept that Buddhism actually inherited from early Brahmanical traditions in India, which would later evolve and become modern-day Hinduism. Gotra is a Sanskrit word meaning clan or family, but you can think of it more like a social class system, not unlike the caste system, with some important differences. The 5 Gotra are traditionally Bodhisattvas, Śvaghoṣas, Pratyeka Buddhas, those in an unknown Gotra, and those without a Gotra. Bodhisattvas are those who hear the teaching and vow to attain Buddhahood and save all sentient beings. Śvaghoṣas are those who hear the teachings and vow to attain individual enlightenment on their own. Pratyeka Buddha means a solitary Buddha. They are those who do not hear the teaching, but attain enlightenment on their own by coming to an understanding of dependent origination. This is a very strange group. These people never ever hear any teachings, but somehow they figure it all out on their own, and not a lot of the scriptural text or scholarly text deals with them that much. Those who are in an unknown Gotra constitute most of the laity. They have not started on the path in any way, so it's not possible to know which Gotra they belong to. Those who don't belong to any Gotra at all are called Ichantakas, and they are those who the earlier tradition believed could not and would not ever reach enlightenment or Buddhahood. These types of people are capable of great good and can attain very high realms of rebirth, but they will never become enlightened because they may slander the teachings or they never remedy their incorrect view of self or something like that. It's possible that these people simply just slander Buddhism, slander teachers of Buddhism, even though they may go out and do good actions in society, and thus accrue merit and accrue high rebirths. I've researched the category Achantaka in the context of Yogacara Buddhism, an early type of Mahāyāna Buddhism, and I believe that the tradition gives a believable justification for the existence of the Achantaka according to their framework, but I personally think that more often than not, it was a word that was used to describe naysayers. It's a catch-all word that many religions around the world have, such as pagan or infidel. It doesn't actually bear any true meaning on something about their nature, other than that they refuse the teaching. So this question of who can become a Buddha and who cannot become a Buddha changes in later traditions that come up in East Asia. These traditions come up with ideas such as Tathagata Garbha, a Sanskrit word which translates to Buddha nature. These traditions hold that Buddha nature is universal in all sentient beings. We all have a nature that is of the Buddha, and thus we can bring that nature out, realize that nature, and live that nature. Another idea that comes up specifically in China and not in India or Nepal is Benshui or Hongaku, which translates to original enlightenment. Original enlightenment is a much later development in Mahāyāna Buddhism, evidenced by the fact that it doesn't exist in Sanskrit and can only be found in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean texts. Buddha nature, Tathagata-garbha, it denies the existence of Achantakas, but it does have space for those beings who can become Buddhas but never ever do. So Achantaka takes on a new meaning with the Buddha nature teaching. So it's very interesting how the definition of Achantaka changes over time as well. So, the doctrine that holds all beings to be originally enlightened, Hongaku, merits that we forget that we are originally enlightened, or we fall into habits that are unenlightened, and thus we have to practice and meditate and study in order to bring that back out and return to our original nature. I would say that these two models are closer to what I personally believe. I don't think that I personally believe in the quote-unquote Buddhist infidel. I think that I believe that everyone does have the potential for good. I think what's interesting about this conversation as well is that it does not weigh in on whether the nature of good or bad is in a person. Rather, it weighs in on the potential of a person to be good and bad. This is an important difference from Western philosophers.
Yeah, in my own Buddhist studies, I'm interested in how there's a lot less of an idea of evil in Buddhism. Like, there's negative karma, but at one point I was looking for an equivalent to, a demon to use in a Buddhist story. And in Buddhism, that's a place. It's not an entity. Naraka is a place you go to, not a group. It's a different way to... I find it interesting that it's specifically being stated here that Achantaka can reach great merit, but are supposedly not going to reach enlightenment, either cannot or will not accept the teachings, I guess.
Exactly. I find that interesting as well. And it's important to remember that there certainly are demons and hell dwellers and evil beings in Buddhism, but Buddhism makes sure to disavow the fact that their evil behavior is conflated with their nature somehow. So even if someone is evil, even if a demon or a hell dweller or anybody is evil and does these evil acts, which are obviously cautioned against in the Buddhist doctrine, even then they still have the potential to turn things around. This is something that comes up in much, much later traditions in Japan, for example, with Nichiren-shu, or the Lotus Sutra school. This school says that sometimes people are evil as a teaching tool, so that they can show others that when they are evil, bad things happen to them. Their karma is poor, and they achieve a poor rebirth. They go to this or that hell, and that causes that person to act better, to devote to the teaching better, and that person accrues good karma. And then suddenly now both of these beings involved in this transaction have better karma. And so the person who did the evil act to start with actually comes up in rebirth. So there's a lot of dynamics going on here. It's very interesting how these different interpretations of good and evil factor in. However, there is a strong moral component to all of these traditions of Buddhism.
So with original enlightenment, you call it, that was Binjue or Hongaku?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when is this original enlightenment supposedly occurring for a given individual? Like, is this something that would happen several lifetimes ago? Is this a state that resets at birth? Like, I'm not understanding what has original enlightenment, I suppose.
That's an important question that also gets debated a lot in China, Korea, and Japan. There are interpretations that sentient beings, only sentient beings, have original enlightenment since they arise in the world. And their arising in the world is in the infinite past. There really is not a creation of the universe story or a huge emphasis on stories that there are for the creation of the universe in Buddhism. However, there is this idea that Buddha nature is sort of like a property of all sentient beings. All sentient beings have sentience, and along with that sentience, they have Buddha nature. However, later Japanese traditions, going as late into history as like the 13, 14, 1500s AD, they say things like all of reality's default property, default nature, default characteristic is Buddha nature. In a concept called Somoku Jōbutsu, all things, including non-sentient things, trees, rocks, mountains, rivers, those things are also originally enlightened. And thus we can look at them as a teaching tool. Because they have original enlightenment, we can see the Dharma, or the teaching, by spending time with them. And that's where we have this image in the West of Buddhism caring a lot about nature and emphasizing spending time in nature, because these traditions thought of nature as a classroom where they could observe Buddhahood all around them and come to understand their own Buddhahood, their own inherent Buddhahood.
I guess the line of thought here is that because I guess I'm trying to understand what a non-sentient Buddha is in this case. The idea is that nature and non-sentient components of nature, your rocks, your trees, your mountains, and so on, are enlightened. Like, what? I don't understand that idea, I guess.
It's good that you asked that. The reason why this seems like we are anthropomorphizing or personifying rocks and trees and rivers and mountains is that one step that we skipped over discussing that I should have probably presented first is that these later traditions end up collapsing the distinction between Buddha and Dharma and nirvana and many, many other things. So to that end, the Dharma is the teaching. The Dharma is the true nature of reality. It is capital T truth, according to the Buddhists. And so by collapsing Buddha and Dharma, the Buddha's life and the sutras, they all become capital T truth. And by collapsing time and space through some other sutras, which we are going to discuss over the course of the podcast, such as the Lotus Sutra and some of the works of Dogen and other such scholars, through collapsing that distinction, we can start to see how non-sentient things become the Dharma. And because they are the Dharma, they're also the Buddha. And because they are the Buddha and the Dharma, we can look at them and contemplate them, spend time with them, observe them, and see the teaching living itself out in some non-sentient way. One of the resources I've included for several of the past episodes is a work by Rupert Gethin called He Who Sees Dharmas Sees the Dharma. And that text first explores the different uses of the word Dharma, which are all confusing and complicated and changes a lot in the texts. But the short version is the teaching exists in everything, everywhere. And it just needs the correct perspective and the correct mindfulness to unpack it and to understand it and to use it for your own enlightenment, for your own practice and your own advancement on the path. So there are no non-sentient Buddhas. It's more that everything, the entirety of reality, and everything in it has changed from being the realm of suffering where the Buddha goes to teach the Dharma, to being the Buddha and the Dharma and cessation and all of that stuff all together in one. This is a very high-level, late Buddhist teaching that we will continue to discuss over the course of the podcast.
Yeah, that sounds like something that I would need to read to properly digest, because it self-references so much that it seems like I need to go back and check which meaning of which word is going on at a given usage. What's happening here is I'm having a difficult time keeping the terminology straight in my head as we're going through So maybe this is a question to return to after having more text in front of me to
Sure.
try to actually process this.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that text will have to come at a later time. We have more to cover here. So let's move to the next question. What does somebody have to do to become a Buddha or realize their Buddhahood?
Regardless of what school a person is a part of, or what their interpretation of Buddhahood is, or what the Buddha is, it's all commonly about meditation and practice. We could be talking about early traditions or later ones, but it's all about practicing as a means to change your behavior mentally and physically to align with principles such as emptiness, non-duality, compassion for all sentient beings, etc. And it's also cultivating wisdom through meditation. Meditation leads to realization, and realization leads to better practice, better ethics, better behavior. Similarly, we can go the other way and say that better behavior and seeing the results of better behavior, better practice, then gives you realization and wisdom that those things are true, those things happen, those things are meaningful and worth contemplating, thus leading you to meditation. So meditation and practice really do go hand in hand as both being means through which to attain realization. When you do one, it inevitably leads into the other. Even those that believe we are all originally and inherently enlightened individuals emphasize that this enlightenment must be lived behaviorally by constant practice. Buddhas don't stop meditating when they become Buddhas. You can't become a Buddha and be done. You can't be enlightened and be done. Enlightenment is not a destination. It's a journey. It's a way of life. They continue to meditate because that's what Buddhas do. Buddhas be Buddhas. That's a very famous Zen quote by Dogen. Arhats and Bodhisattvas, as we've discussed before, have some different practices prescribed for them. Bodhisattvas have to work to save all sentient beings before their own enlightenment. This can take eons. Arhats have to work to attain enlightenment for themselves. This can also take eons, but it's got different practices prescribed for it. However, both of them have to cultivate mindfulness, the Eightfold Path. They have to realize and act upon the Four Noble Truths, and they have to spend a lot of time meditating and practicing. Lots of self-cultivation and lots of morality, as well as lots of controlling one's thoughts and feelings, and lots of trying to understand the implications of the teachings as they apply to the individual and to reality as a whole.
So the core of it is in meditation and meditating the right way, which got into great detail on when we were talking about the Mahāyānasūtrālaṃkāra Sutra. We've already talked at length about what a Buddhist is supposed to actually do while they're meditating, and it's a matter of continuing to do that until you're really good at it, I suppose. Maybe that's not the right way to frame it.
I would say so, because there is no destination. At least most of the later traditions, including the popular ones in the United States and Europe, including the ones that are practiced the most now, even in East Asia, there is no stop. There is no cessation to the practice. Even once you have attained nirvana, even once you have attained enlightenment, you're still in a meditative state. You're still practicing. And so there is the idea of getting really good at it, but there also is the goal continually getting further and further and further forward or further away. So once you have realized this truth, there is another truth to realize, to meditate on, to spend a lifetime devoted to. Once you've cultivated this merit or this good behavior, you can still cultivate others and others and others. It's actually quite difficult to attain enlightenment, which we think of as omniscience in Buddhism. It's quite difficult, and it takes a very, very long time, and it takes a lot of practice. Imagine having to read and learn and come to know literally everything. And I mean quite literally everything. And while you're doing that, while you're in that process, all of those things are changing because of impermanence. So when you have gotten to X and Y destination in your learning, where you came from, where you started, is now different. So you have to go back. And you can start to see how this takes eons, and it's very recursive. And you start to see how meditation and how realization comes to be so transformative in the Buddhist mindset. Whenever you have these aha moments, whenever you have sudden enlightenment moments, you start to realize that, oh, there's quite a lot to this. And you see that these sudden enlightenment moments are but pieces of a very, 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 very large and long journey. So I don't think that there is a conclusion to this. And I think that that's the point.
All right, well,
that's our topic for this week. Join us next week where we will discuss Buddhist modernism. What is it? Why does it exist? Why should we be knowledgeable of it and perhaps critical about it? Thank you for listening.
Thank you. See you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Our email is bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com.
You can find us on Twitter at Bright Buddhism.
As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.